Hi, listeners. This is Chris Batts, your host of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. Today's episode, I'm speaking with a general counsel of a global company and his perspective on corporate legal department trends, what he looks for in new team members, why law firms need to deliver more value, and much more. Just a reminder, the PDF transcript of this audio is available to download. Go to linegrouprerecruiting.com/podcast. As many of you know, we interview corporate defense law firm leaders, partners, general counsels, and legal consultants. You are listening to episode number 17 of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Broadcasting from Kansas City, this is the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In each episode, you'll receive actionable ideas and hear personal leadership stories of the top corporate defense law firms from around the United States. Enjoy a front row seat with law firm leaders, their partners, and legal consultants as we discuss life and leadership.
Welcome to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Batts with the Lion Group. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Mark Smolik, General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer of DHL Supply Chain. Mark Smolik leads the company's legal and commercial contracts management, compliance, and economic development teams. He also serves as global chair of the company's supply chain legal service practice group. Prior to DHL, he served as Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Chief Ethics Officer of Safety Light Auto Glass, and was previously in-house at the Sherwin-Williams Company. Mark received his JD from the Cleveland Marshall College of Law and his Bachelor of Arts degree from the John Carroll University. He is a frequent speaker, the author of several publications on the changing dynamics of the legal industry. Welcome, Mark, to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to join you today.
Mark, I want to jump in because I think you carry just a very insightful view of the changes in the legal industry. And so can you just expound on what you see being the general counsel of a global company, your perspective on the legal marketplace right now? What's happening?
To put it in perspective, DHL is surely a global company. We operate in 222 different countries. My area of responsibility for the company is, as you mentioned, in legal and commercial contract management in the Americas for our supply chain operation. But in many of the changes that I have seen, particularly in the 28 years that I have been in-house, I've never seen as radical a change as has been taking place in the past 8 years. And historically, particularly when you look at the operation of a legal department, the costs of running the department really fall into two different areas. One, the fixed cost, and that's the people, and the pens and the paper and everything that it takes to run the department and to support the people that work in-house in the department. But Chris, the other side of the dynamic is the variable cost, and oftentimes that can be significantly more expensive, more costly to an organization, and that typically involves the amounts of money and fees, expenses that are expended, retaining outside counsel, and in some instances, particularly in today's legal market, alternative legal services providers. But for decades, I have seen, personally working in-house, a seller's market, where law firms literally dictated the terms of sale, how often they would bill you, what they would bill you, what they would bill you for, and outlined the expectations with regard to when payments were due, etc. But things have drastically shifted. And that shift, as I see it and I've experienced it, began really in 2008, when through the various challenges that multiple industries went through globally, a lot of changes started to take place in law departments who have consistently and for many, many years been under pressure to do more with less, but who had to then figure out, how do I do more with less? Especially when I look at how I am spending my money, either on the fixed side of the house with my people or the variable side of the house with regard to outside counsel. And so in many regards, general's counsel began to take a more intensive focus on the financial and the operational aspects of the department. Of course, they're stewards of all things legal in the department, seeking to mitigate risk, identify trends for the business, and provide input from a legal perspective that would have a meaningful impact on the operation so that they can adjust their own operations to avoid, if not mitigate, risks. But in many regards, as they continued that focus, General Counsel began to take an approach consistently, as I have seen it, in pressuring their outside counsel to deliver more and more meaningful value. And in so doing, putting more and more at risk, if not in jeopardy, the traditional hourly rate billing arrangement that has been the mainstay in the legal industry, particularly for law firms, for decades. And as that pressure continued to grow from the corporate law department, there was more and more demands with regard to what services would be delivered and when. And not only in my time at Sherwin-Williams did I begin to experiencing a bit of a shift towards alternative fee agreements, but surely towards the end of my tenure at Safelite Auto Glass, and I left that organization in 2009. But as I joined DHL, I saw a significant shift. And the shift was one from a seller's market, where the law firms were dictating the terms of sale, to now the buyer's market. And it is something that began at a relatively quick pace, and today, at least in my experience, has completely transformed the market into a buyer's market. But it's not one that's isolated to just here in the United States. It's something that I have experienced with my team in Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, many of the countries that we have operations in. And I am hearing from my peers and other generals counsel in Europe and in Asia and elsewhere throughout the world. So it is a dynamic that has global impact throughout the industry, but it is definitely one that has shifted a lot of the buying power.
Mark, with it turning into a buyer's market, tell me about how does that look? So knowing that there's downward pressure on the entire pyramid of law firm economics based on the billable hour, shifting to alternative fee arrangements, and then with the encroaching competition that classic law firms are facing, how are you approaching this whole process as a buyer now versus kind of being dictated how to acquire services?
The approach is first one of you've got to recognize that from a business perspective, there is a balance. And the balance is between what it is that the buyer of the service, typically the corporate legal department, wants to accomplish, sometimes with the support of their procurement departments, where much of the goal is to procure services at the lowest common denominator possible. And then on the other side of the equation, of course, is the balance with the law firms who the corporate law departments need and view often as an extension of their department. And the seller of the services has an entire infrastructure to support as well. So I mentioned that early on in this comment, Chris, because even though I have seen this shift, it is a shift that needs to recognize that balance. And there is a harmony between what it is that the corporate law departments are demanding, which is more value at a total lower cost, and what the law firms can deliver given the infrastructure that they have in place. It can't just be one-sided. There has to be this balance. And oftentimes that balance can best be achieved, and I've seen this with my own team, not only here at DHL, but at Safelite as well, when you sit down and you have a conversation on expectations. And it's not only the expectations of what needs to be achieved in a particular project, whether it's a piece of litigation, whether it's a finance-related deal, whether it is some other commercial transaction. But oftentimes, where I see gaps between the provider of the service, the law firm, and the buyer of the service on the corporate law department, is there is little time taken to proactively sit down and just address expectations and talk about what those expectations are. I often hear from law firms when I have an opportunity to speak with folks like you or audiences that you are broadcasting this podcast to, or even just cold calls from law firms saying, what are your thoughts with regard to what we should do, particularly when it comes to embracing or acknowledging, dealing with some of these changes? And the advice is pretty simple. Sit down with your client, make sure that you understand the expectations, review the work or the projects that you've been doing, whether it's a one-off, whether it has been for years, but understand where your strengths are and where your gaps are. and continue to polish the strengths, but by all means close the gaps. But you're not going to be able to achieve ultimately a pure and a strong understanding of the value proposition unless you sit down and you have the conversation. And when I get the same question from either people in legal operations or general's counsel, my advice is the same thing. And oftentimes it comes down to a simple message of, look, folks, you sit down with your employees in the legal department, and every year with the support of your HR team, you give your people a performance review, and you tell them what they're doing well and what they're not. And in many regards, that will dictate in their success and the value that they bring to your own organization. And oftentimes it's a roadmap for their career success. If you're doing that with your people and you're seeing that it's paying dividends within your internal team, then by all means do it with your external team. Because you're only going to succeed as a legal department if you do have harmony and alignment between the internal and the external team. And there's got to be the balance between what it is that you're expecting and what it is that they can deliver at a price point, particularly for the law firms, that meets their internal expectations and also addresses yours.
Tell me this. I mean, and let's use this as an example of relationship that you use as a story before we started recording about you having class action. And so it was the collaboration of multiple outsourced firms. And tell me about, I mean, from my perspective, I think the unique approach that you brought them to your headquarters and had to start collaborating. Can you describe that story for my listeners?
It's no secret that our organization in the United States, particularly because it is public, has been on the challenging end of some class action litigation, particularly in the employment or independent contractor perspective, primarily out of California, but we're one of, unfortunately, thousands of companies that seem to be on the list of a plaintiff's bar out on the West Coast with regard to significant industry players. But we were sued in a number of jurisdictions, not just California, and we had class counsel in each of the venues where these lawsuits were pending. And we brought in representatives from each of the law firms' indoor headquarters here in Columbus, Ohio. And we sat and, most importantly, made sure that everybody understood who was handling what piece of litigation, what the status of the litigation was, and what their individual role or responsibility was collectively in all the various pieces of litigation that we had pending at the time around the country. The time that we had what we'll call this class action defense summit, we had 9 class action lawsuits pending against us. The most important thing that came out of that is competitors, all of whom would like to be handling all of this litigation and being paid the fees, first and foremost heard from us exactly what we expected with regard to our expectations. We told them how we were going to evaluate their performance, and we identified for them a set of key performance indicators, we call them KPIs, that we will use during the course of and on the conclusion of the litigation to evaluate their performance. And we will be evaluating each of the firms against each other. Now, it wasn't a hyper-competitive play. It wasn't a means to do anything more than let people know this is exactly how you're going to be evaluated. Most importantly, this is what we expect of you. And as you go through this, you are not 9 independent firms. You are all an extension of this department. It is as if you are working within the 4 walls of this organization. And we expect you to collaborate. And we expect you to share research. And we expect you to share briefing. You're all going to be researching the same rules of civil procedure. Share the research. And, Chris, it worked wonderfully. We ended up with a situation where I had designated one of my most senior people on my team as the lead coordinator among counsel. But what I ended up seeing in many regards were significant synergies captured through the billing, because I did not see 9 firms billing for the same Rule 56C summary judgment research, for example. I did see synergies between them. So just sitting down and having that summit which took the better part of a day, provide us with a significant return on that investment. And it is a model that we continue to leverage today. Although fortunately we are, at least for the moment, outside the crosshairs of the plaintiff's bar with regard to the employment in the independent class action litigation. But on some of our more sophisticated transactions, we are still leveraging that same sit-down summit type approach.
And Mark, did you have resistance from any of your clients, either before, during, or after that summit?
I think you mean from the law firms. Initially, There was a few raised eyebrows of, really? We're going to sit down with firms that we compete against to talk about how we can work and collaborate together? Everybody showed up, and everybody was the consummate professional. But what may have been a bit of skepticism within that first 15, 20 minutes of us explaining to everybody the purpose of the summit, what we were seeking to accomplish and why we were seeking to accomplish it and what our end game was, in other words, what our goal coming out of this was, it became a non-event. And it really was as if 9 firms were part and parcel of this law department.
Yeah, it's amazing. When you shared the story with me, I was quite intrigued, and I think it would be very helpful for other general counsel and even law firms to know of the strategy you guys took place. So I appreciate you sharing that story. You know, and kind of in tandem with that, I'd love for you to expound on, again, this accountability of corporate legal departments and outside counsel law firms. There was another article I read that you were written about, and you shared about 7 KPIs. I don't know if that's the consistent number of KPIs you use with outside counsel, but would you be able to expand on that?
Sure. The KPIs that you're referring to are something that I first came up with the better part of 10 years ago when I was at Safelite Auto Glass. Safelite is a rather large privately held company. We were dealing with a fair amount of litigation at the time. And in fact, it was bet the company litigation filed by a competitor. And I won't get into too much of the detail, but it involved a significant number of firms being employed by the company and significant numbers of lawyers at the various firms as well. But in my role at Safelite, I was also the head of HR. And Chris, when I was looking at what we were doing in HR day in and day out, and making sure we had the right talent and the right jobs and people were being held accountable to certain performance standards, I was asking my people in procurement and people in finance what we were doing with our outside service providers to hold them at least accountable to the same standards that we're being held accountable to. And I'd have those conversations, but I'd have the same conversations with friends of mine who were either in-house in legal departments or in HR at other companies, and I was getting the same answers. Well, we don't do anything with the outside. And I said, but why? You're spending more outside than you are inside. We need to be better fiscal stewards of the money that we are spending and make sure that we are evaluating performance of outside service providers to the same objective standards as we do inside. So I sat down and said, look, here are the themes against which we evaluate our in-house people. Let's do the same with our outside counsel. And that's where the original 7 KPIs that you're referring to came from. There's many more that we use at this point that are more focused on the Net Promoter Score and the true value driver so that you can objectively measure and evaluate it. But the interesting dynamic that I have seen over the years in following those KPIs and focusing on the value proposition is the improvement in the service level. I can't tell you how many more of my own law firms who years ago did not have the opportunity to have the discussion because we hadn't kicked this off, who hear the story about working for a very entrepreneurial company, which DHL is. And we were founded by 3 companies. There really was a DH&L who founded the company back in 1969. But when people hear that, look, you're working for a business made up of entrepreneurs, and these are business people, and they want to identify and mitigate risk as much as they can, and one of your roles is to be proactive in helping us do so, and outlining for them how we think and how we expect our outside service providers to think as well, that just leads to a much better roadmap for increased service. And what I've ended up seeing over the years, particularly with a number of my firms, they are being much more proactive in their representation of us. They are much more business focused when it comes to how they address issues with which they are dealing with us, and in many regards anticipate our needs. I can't tell you how much of and I guess the right word to use is a joy it is to get an email from outside counsel on a new matter where the email is literally ghost written for me that all I need to do is cut, paste, and send it to my board.
Oh, wow.
Long gone are the emails of, hey, Mark, there's a new case. I think here's a link to it. Maybe you ought to read it. Like many in-house attorneys, I don't have the time. But when somebody does take the time because they understand what our expectations are to summarize a new development in law or have a relationship with somebody in the business where they send that to them unsolicited, it really drives the value proposition for the firm.
I just like your forward-thinking approach that seems to have been going on for some time, and the expectations that it's driving to your own departments, which is clearly understood just from a value business proposition because you're at a company that thinks entrepreneurially, and then it's fascinating to hear the thought leadership that's coming from the clients as you're driving that to the firms and making them better. I wanted to ask you if you could expound on just this trend, that it being a buyer's market, but at the same time, the growth of the corporate legal department world. Can you explain that, and feel free to use, DHL as an example?
Sure. When it comes to a buyer's market, you look at a couple of things, and if you just look at the data that is out there from multiple sources, whether it is Altman-Weil surveys or whether it is surveys put out by Georgetown Law School, et cetera, you look at the changes, particularly over the course of the past couple of decades, and I won't walk you through all of those, but ultimately we are at a point where when you look at the various survey data and that data segregates out where corporate law departments are spending their money, you're seeing that 53% of law department spend is internally. And that to me is shocking. I can recall the days at Sherwin-Williams where we had a relatively large law department. It was a global operation. And we were more likely to have a 20% spend internally, 80% externally. That was just the makeup of the organization. When I started at DHL, we surely followed that format. And we have completely flipped that on its head for a number of reasons. One, when I joined the company, and I don't think I'm unique in this regard, it was just more of a business approach to how we do what we do and the accountability of every function in our department to make sure that they have meaningful metrics that are reported to the business. We looked at where we were spending our money, the fixed side and the variable side. The variable side was way too high. We did an inventory, Chris, of what work are we doing that we would consider to be commodity work. For example, our real estate leasing. We have hundreds and hundreds of facilities just in the United States where there are leases that are done and reviewed or touched every single year. The same is true with regard to employment claims. Almost all of that work was outsourced to outside counsel. We brought it all in-house. We spend virtually nothing with outside counsel now with regard to real estate leasing work. Very limited exceptions, but very, very little money. The same is true with regard to our historical spend on employment. And the same is true with regard to historical spend on commercial contracts and related transactions. Almost all of that work is done in-house. So we've either recruited people from other corporate law departments or in many regards from law firms to come in and do that work, which is why there has been, in many regards, some pretty significant growth in the numbers of people in our department. When I started, we were a team of 7. Today, we're a team of 58. Now, there's been some people in other departments that have been merged into the legal department as it has continued to grow. But it is part of this shift into the buyer's market that involves a focus not only by general's counsel, but also by people in legal operations that general's counsel are putting into place to make sure the departments, law departments in particular, are being run like a business. Mm-hmm. particularly so that they can account for every dollar that they're spending. And in a hyper-competitive market, especially a market that we operate in, where margins are only so finite, you've only got so much money to spend, and you're going to have to be very, very vigilant as to how you spend that money.
Thank you for that. Mark, let's jump to something that I know my listeners also want to know about from your perspective. What do you look for in recruiting and hiring new in-house attorneys? I imagine that role is just constantly changing as you're turning your legal department into a law firm internally. So what do you guys look for?
Chris, I'm going to address that from two perspectives. The first being new attorneys fresh out of school. And second being new attorneys who may have some experience that we're seeking to bring into the department. I did something a couple of years ago I've never done, and I thought I would never do. And that is I hired 2 freshly minted law students out of Ohio State University Law School. Of course, we're based in Columbus, Ohio. There was a natural fit there. We sat down, we talked with the dean of the law school about what we were seeking to do at the time, and we created what was referred to as 2 fellowship positions. So we brought 2 new students in, and we assigned them to work with 2 senior people within the organization. We made sure that we had a training program in place to help make these folks as productive as possible. But 2 years into what one might call a bit of a let's see how it works, I wouldn't say experiment, I've got 2 very high-performing people that are very engaged with the business, that are getting experience and exposure in a corporate setting that, quite candidly, when I roll the clock back to 1990, when I joined Sherwin-Williams and I was a 3-year attorney coming out of a law firm, I never had. And there is a number of reasons why I think it has been so successful for us. First and foremost, what we were looking for, surely not book smarts. Anybody who comes out of law school has got a sense of book smarts, especially if they pass the bar exam. But first and foremost, we're looking for, is this person somebody that will fit among the team? When you're that junior, it's hard to tell, but it's more of the chemistry, it's more of the personality. The more senior the person, whether it's 5 or 7 or 9 or 10 years out of school, sure, you're looking for the experience, and do they have the knowledge, the wherewithal to be able to pick up a practice group area or maybe a subject matter expert in a particular area as well. But I really don't care how much experience you have in those areas. If you are not going to fit within the team, you're not going to succeed. And we, like many corporate law departments, invest an awful lot of time in talent development. And in many regards, it's tough to bring somebody in and have it not work out. So we spend an awful lot of time vetting, now through panel interview settings, people joining the department, whether it's legal, commercial contracts management, or the economic development team, to make sure that we have a fit. But that decision is not just made by people in our department. New candidates will interview with the business, they'll interview with HR, and in many regards, at least one other senior member of the management team.
What led you, Mark, to actually bring in 2 inexperienced or no experienced attorneys from law school?
The dean of Ohio State Law School asked me, Chris, it's as simple as that.
Really?
He called. He said, let's go to lunch. I want you to think about something. I told him, his name is Alan. I said, Alan, never thought about it. Why would I do that? But in the ensuing several months that I evaluated that, and it took me a bit of time to get my head around it. I sat down with my people in legal operations and I said, I want you to pull some information for me. Look at the prior 2 years of all of the billing of first and second year associates from the law firms that had billed us. And this was employment and just general matters. We weren't doing a lot of employment, but just in general. And I got the list. And I said, okay, on average, it's about $325 an hour. And then we just chatted as a team. Folks, what value are we getting for that? And then we literally sat down and said, all right, this is what it's going to cost us all in, fully loaded, to bring in somebody fresh, comparable to somebody who's at the law firm. Well, why not do it on our own? Yeah, there may be some challenges that we have with regard to training. particularly initially. There may be additional time that we need to invest as a team, but we're going to be able to deliver a service at a much lower cost for a first and second year associate. And we're going to have somebody who is ingrained in the organization getting to know people. But Chris, something happened I never anticipated. And I still am surprised. The two folks that I did bring in that are obviously still with me today, they have brought into the department a younger client base within our own organization. I don't mean within my department, but among the various people that they touch and that they interact with in the business, there are more and more people with whom they are interacting that are within their age group that are seeking legal services. And that surprised me. So there was an unknown, there was surely an unknown there, but one that has been very, very beneficial.
You had brought up the insight that you had about, who's entering the legal market right now and in dealing with attorney supply, the pipeline of attorneys. Can you expound on that for my listeners and just what you're noticing? Because it's interesting you talk about so you were just approached by the dean and you brought on two brand new minted associates in essence, but, in-house counsel. And it sounds like extremely beneficial from lots of standpoints. But what do you see overall from a high level perspective with the supply of attorneys?
A concern, and it's a pretty deep concern. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the supply of new lawyers coming in and you evaluate what is going on in law schools, particularly the ABA law schools throughout the United States, enrollment in law school is down significantly. In some regards, some people will say 25, 30, if not in some schools, 40%. Now, there are many of the Ivy League schools that are exceptions to that, but by and large, the statistics show law school enrollment is way down. If I take just my own law school, it is down significantly over the course of the past 25 years, and that's true for most of the law schools in Ohio. Now, there's many factors that are driving that, Chris, whether it has to do with the opportunities in law or the Great Recession that people like me refer to that began in 2008, shifting to a buyer's market and what those opportunities are coming out of law school, let alone the cost. But the fact of the matter is the pipeline coming in is small. And when you look at the data that has been published, particularly with regard to the demographics of the licensed bar in the United States, we have roughly 1.4 million licensed attorneys in the U.S. Now they're working in various capacities, private, public sectors, some not even necessarily using their law degree in their day-to-day employment activities. But if I compare, for example, just pick a 25-year period of time between 1980 and 2005. Back in 1980, 36% of all licensed lawyers were 35 years or younger. By 2005, it was 13%.
Oh, wow.
As of the end of last year, 4% of all licensed attorneys in the United States are under the age of 30.
Wow.
The growing gap between who is entering, especially at a typical billing rate that is affordable, and where the bulk of the licensed lawyers are working, which is 74% being between the ages of 35 and 65, is pretty significant. It continues to grow. When you look at what will happen to that group over the course of the next 10 years, unless we have significant enrollments back into law school in a pipeline that is much bigger than it is right now, we're going to have a talent gap. But it's going to create significant opportunities. And it's going to be opportunities that expand beyond the dynamics of the traditional law firm market. And those opportunities will fall into the hands of alternative legal service providers, whether it's e-discovery companies, whether it is companies that evaluate performance of alternative legal service providers, let alone law firms. But there will be multiple opportunities created. But at the end of the day, there is still advice that has to be given by people to people. And my biggest concern, especially given that I've got hopefully a number of years left in my career, is where's the next generation coming from? When I add on to that just the change in the number of employed lawyers over a period of almost 20 years ending in 2016, we look at the growth of corporate law departments in-house, and they have grown by over 200%. When you look at law firms, that same growth over that same period of time has been a little over 25%, and yet government's not quite 50%. So law firm growth, which historically has employed 75+% of lawyers for decades, is pretty flat year over year over a 20-year period of time. And the real explosive growth area continues to be in-house. So you see this continued shift, not just in the buyer's market, but where lawyers are actually going to practice their trade. And it is with the client.
Yeah, it's definitely something to watch, and I appreciate your insights. I mean, and just the observations over the years and how that's going to dramatically affect things. And I have to say, I appreciate your hopeful perspective on it, even just knowing that there's opportunity. Mark, let me jump into just kind of a last question around more of the business discussion, which can you just give us your perspective on what's happening to the law firm side of things as far as consolidation and where this is all going? I know you had mentioned to me at one point that firms aren't changing fast enough. Where do you see this heading?
There will continue to be consolidation. I mean, just look at last week with Sedgwick out of the West Coast deciding it's going to close its doors. You see some of the largest law firms in the world, Denton's, for example, acquiring or merging or joining forces with law firms around the world. And I think that will continue. I saw a statistic within the past couple of weeks that in the past 5 years, 2,000 law firms have either dissolved or gone out of business. That's of every shape and size. And if needed, I can get you the specific reference for that. But I don't see that changing. I do see the law firm model continuing to be challenged, and that model being based on the historical hourly billing rate. There has to be a different approach. And the law firm or the law firms that come up with a billing model that is more reflective of how their clients sell their own services are the ones that are going to be the most successful. But even if the hourly billing rate does not change, and I am completely wrong in that capacity, the firms that truly understand what value means to their clients and how their clients are evaluating their performance are the ones that are going to be the most successful. I've seen that in my time in HR when I was at Safelite. I see that with my own people as well. But there will be continued consolidation, and it's going to open, in my opinion, and I think the right word to use is just significant, if not massive, opportunities for alternative service providers. There will be continued discussion about technology and how technology can be leveraged. But Chris, I've been very upfront with my firms, particularly when it comes to technology. Invest as you may. It matters not to me what you invest in. If the ultimate cost of your service, because you are investing in technology to improve your efficiencies, did not ultimately reflect itself in better and more meaningful value, whether measured in dollars or measured in service to my organization. What I have heard from many, many law firms is, yes, we have invested significant amounts of money in technology. But when I sit down and I have the conversation of how is that driving efficiency and offering me a better return on investment, what I end up hearing is it's helping protect the margin of the law firm. And that is fine. But at the end of the day, there has to be something meaningful for me. So I'm hoping that as the service providers, particularly the law firms, continue to invest in technology, they find the appropriate balance to deal with their cost structure from the cost of service delivered that ultimately does reflect itself in a more affordable financial model for the client.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So time will tell. It'll be interesting to see who survives this continued tsunami of change hitting the legal industry, and I appreciate your insights. Mark, as I like to shift towards more personal questions with these leaders of the legal industry that I enjoy interviewing like you, I wanted to ask you, so what are you currently passionate about right now?
Well, Chris, on the personal side, passionate, perhaps more prideful, of two sons, both of whom are grown adults, one of whom most recently passed the Ohio Bar and was sworn in as an attorney here in Ohio, working for a law firm here in Ohio. So he's got his first full-time employment position in a law firm. And time will tell how his career may develop, but he grew up in a household where the dinner room conversation was largely around law, so he's got an awful lot of exposure to that already. The second is my son, who graduated from Dayton, University of Dayton, as did my older son as well, who works in aeronautical engineering for General Electric. So they are both just this year kicking off their careers. Literally 30 years ago to in many regards, the week for my older son and the year for my younger son that I kicked off my legal career. So it was pretty telling for us. Wow. I'm also just celebrated my 30th wedding anniversary with my wife.
Oh, congratulations.
Who I met at John Carroll. Thank you. Who I met at John Carroll University. And when I am not in the office or spending time with the boys or my wife or family, I am an avid woodworker and have been for the better part of 35 years. We make a lot of furniture, much of which we donate.
Really?
In fact, a piece of that furniture was donated to somebody in the military as a new kitchen set. But it is something that we take an awful lot of pride in, not only cutting down the tree and milling it and actually building the furniture from there.
So let me get this straight. You were a carpenter by trade?
When I was 17 years old, I went to work for a construction company doing the work that nobody wanted to do. Uh-huh. But I continued to work for that company and learned construction, and then broke out and formed my own construction company when I was at the tail end of college, and I worked my way as a sub-trade contractor through law school. And that served as the basis for my carpentry and woodworking skills today.
That's fun. And do you do the woodworking yourself, or do you have either your sons or other people who join you in the creation of the furniture?
No, the boys do it with me.
Oh, that's fun.
Oh, yeah. In fact, much of the furniture in my son's condominium, my oldest son's condominium, he and I worked on. And my youngest son in where he lives, we worked on much of the furniture in his place as well.
And you don't sell it, so this isn't necessarily a business, correct?
No. I've got wood everywhere. We've got a warehouse with wood. We've got a pretty big workshop. We've had some people ask for pieces, but no, I don't charge people for what we make.
That's amazing. So it's safe to say that, being charitable and generous is a family value for you guys.
It always has been, and fortunately, I still have 10 fingers, and I just take my time when I'm working on the furniture.
That's good.
Just make sure I keep the dust down.
That's excellent. I know most carpenters can't say that, keeping their fingers. But let me ask another question I always tend to ask people I interview, because like myself and most attorneys out there, they're big readers. What are you reading right now? Do you have any recommendations, things for the audience to pick up and thumb through?
There's a book out there called Speak Like a CEO. It was written by the best-selling author Suzanne Bates, and she has published a book recently captioned All the Leader You Can Be, and it is about the science of achieving extraordinary executive presence. It is something that resonates pretty deeply with me, particularly from my HR background and my own team, and making sure that we're working on career development plans, but it is one that I highly recommend to people. It focuses not just on the theory, but insight into character and substance and style and different leadership styles and how to adapt as well. But All the Leader You Can Be by Suzanne Bates.
I know you had mentioned that you do enjoy fiction. Do you have any fiction books or authors that you recommend as well?
When we're sitting, as we do as a family, and we do a lot of boating, and there's just quiet time sitting out on the lake, I just like a good John Grisham novel. Mm-hmm. The stories build on each other, and I always find them pretty interesting, sometimes hard to put down.
Yep. I'd have to echo that myself. Well, in closing, let me just ask you a question that I sometimes ask different people I interview, but let me just ask this to you. So, Mark, what advice would you give yourself if you were to go back 30 years and start your career over again as an attorney? What advice would you give yourself?
Network, and network.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I waited 20 years to do it.
Oh, wow.
And it's not that it was an anchor or it held me back, but there was so much focus working my way through Sherwin-Williams for 13 years. Of course, you've got the family, and I was traveling a lot internationally. And then starting at Safelight when I was 38 years old as a general counsel, and kind of the wonderment of what does all this mean. I was more focused on the job and what I needed to do the job efficiently and effectively than anything else. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I met some people who are very, very influential in my professional and personal life that I really found how valuable that network can be and how much it will help facilitate you doing your job easier or anything that you want to do in life easier. So I encourage not just my sons, but the two very young people that have come into the organization, and even my senior leadership, and one person yesterday who is in the prime of his career, but encouraging, look, speak on panels, get your name out there, network with people, because the more and more you network, the more you're going to find not only opportunities coming your way in a number of different capacities, but particularly when you're networking at events where there may be other in-house counsel, some of whom may be customers of our organization, the more easier it is for us to facilitate some business transactions. So get out there, and it's something that we invest a fair amount of money in to make sure that people do have those opportunities.
Right. And so you mentioned speaking, you mentioned event-driven networking. So it's more face-to-face than even something like social media or LinkedIn for you?
Well, I am still a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to how to effectively use social media.
That's all right.
But the value of your forum with regard to particularly the reputation that you have, Chris, is very, very strong. And your audience is very, very broad. But whether or not it is through this type of social media that you and I are engaged in right now, or speaking at an event, or just writing an article about something, or offering to be on a panel, let alone getting involved in an organization such as ACC, Association of Corporate Counsel, even in a small role, will help expand that network. And I'm repeating myself a bit, but I've had the opportunity to do that now for the better part of 10 years. And there are multiple instances where when we do have issues with customers, I will know somebody in the in-house department, if not the general counsel, to be able to call and say, hey, we've got an issue that we've got to work ourselves through. But you've got to be proactive in doing it. And it takes work. Sometimes it can take a lot of work.
Yeah. It
pays dividends.
I can see how that happens, and it makes a lot of sense. Well, Mark, I really appreciate your time today. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Well, Chris, I'm very delighted that you had me, and thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. This podcast is for education purposes only. This content cannot be used for commercial use without written permission from the Lion Group. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes.